Back in the distant past of 2001, that was 21 years ago. Fuck, I'm old. Microsoft published a small indie game called Halo Combat Evolved, which, as I understand, was mildly successful. I'm taking the piss here, obviously. Halo is a massive franchise, and while it has stumbled in recent years, back in the day it was the gold standard of shooters. So much so that every Tom, Dick and Harry was advertising the new shooter on the market as the Halo Killer. And as you can guess, most completely missed the mark. None were as high profile as Haze. Sitting at a tepid 55 on Metacritic, it fell flat on its face at the feet of Halo. Is it truly as bad as that score would suggest? Join me as we ask, how bad was Haze really? Interestingly enough, the start of Haze is, at least from a story perspective, pretty damn good. It starts you off in an elevator with a bunch of stereotypical dude bro soldier men, very much the "we're the good guys" type deal, but it doesn't take long for you to notice something seems a bit off. The robotic voice constantly administering, and how everyone talks like they're on something. That's something, of course, being Nectar, a MacGuffin super soldier serum thing that makes men of Mantle a nigh unstoppable fighting force against the cruel regimes around the world. Remember that, because this will be important later. In typical FPS fashion, not much plot happens for a while until we end up chasing down the leader of the Promised Hand, that's the game's big bad, Skin Coat, named as such because he flays people and wears their skin as a coat. So, charming individual. But it's when you get into the copper plat that things get really messed up. I mean, Duvall's whole ape speech was pretty bad, but this is where things go really far south. Where your squad mates start talking about killing unarmed civilians like it's the most normal thing in the world. Where your Nectar administrator starts failing, and you get to see how bad things really are. And when you finally get to Skin Coat, he's a dude in a sleeveless jacket. No flayed skin or anything. And he's actually a pretty reasonable guy. Then Duvall turns up and cuts off one of his fingers in retaliation for stealing their nectar, and that pretty much is where any veneer completely falls off. And honestly, this is such a good concept. A lot of shooters, especially of the time, like to unflinchingly paint you as the good guys. So when this happened, I was honestly excited to see where it would go. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a deconstruction of the genre, but it definitely veers closer to Spec Ops: The Line territory than Halo. Unfortunately, the game doesn't do a whole lot more with that concept. Sure, when you eventually join up with the Promised Hand after turning against your squad, you find out that Nectar numbs people to the atrocities they're committing, and find out slightly later that using it straight up kills people. But then the game descends into very standard shooter fare, and the Promised Hand falls into the same pitfalls that Mantle's soldiers did, only without the hyper-steroids dulling perception. Marino even starts saying the same stuff Duvall did, going so far as to suggest using Nectar themselves before the game just abruptly ends. I'm not even kidding, it just cuts to black after Marino finishes speaking. I actually thought there was a post-credit scene I'd missed when I'd skipped them, but no, just ends. The game also has an issue with pacing, mainly when you get to the point where you're with the rebels. Marino goes on about how his men won't trust you because you are with Mantle. But gameplay-wise, there is no conflict or difficulties. They just accept you with open arms and you're off killing again. There are also some weird contradictions the game has where the Promised Hands are concerned. Namely, for a rebel faction allegedly formed of villagers and other regular people, A, why did they go with the name Promised Hand, which sounds aggressively like a drug cartel and a cult rolled into one? B, how on earth do they have so much military hardware if they had no army beforehand? And C, where on earth did they get an intercontinental ballistic missile? Was it just lying around? Did they find it in a Tesco car park or something? The game just drops this on you and decides that no one would ever question this. All in all, story-wise the game had a good starting premise, but never really followed through, and ultimately the narrative gets twisted at the end, so gameplay can continue on as always. Speaking of gameplay, it's a mixed bag. Let's start with the good and work our way up to the bad, shall we? The gunplay is actually pretty good for the most part. This should go without saying as it's from Free Radical, the boys from Old Blighty behind the much beloved Time Splitters games. There is a certain amount of weight to the shooting, not that the guns are recoiling like crazy, but it feels nice to use most weapons. Something else that elevates it is that they properly modelled the geometry. Too often in older shooters you'll be able to see an enemy past or through an object, only to be completely unable to shoot them because the fence or barrier is just a solid mass, and you're just left staring at bullet holes in the air, with bullet holes in your ass. These guys modelled objects to function how you'd expect them to in real life. Anything that looks like you can shoot through can be. Created walkways, fences, even stacks of girders. Moments where your nectar stops working and you're made to play through sections without the increased durability and reflexes and are made to witness things how they really are super unnerving and adds a level of impact to what you're doing. It's such a raw feeling compared to how muted the prior sections are and how disconnected you feel in a lot of shooters. The only issue is that it only happens in one section of the game and then is quietly swept under the rug. Even after you're off the nectar, I understand this could become annoying if it happens throughout the game, but it does feel like you lose a lot through its absence. Probably an unpopular opinion, but I like the different mechanics of each side of the conflict. Mantle being more of your stereotypical super soldier with the nectar making them more durable and deadly, with the added effect that too much throws you into a frenzy and makes you much stronger, with the downside of being unable to control who you shoot at. Anything caught in the crosshairs gets a bullet or 20. Friend, foe, your grandma, everyone. Compare that to the Promised Hand, who are much more geared towards guerrilla tactics, with the grenade creation, traps and abilities to fake their deaths to make mantle soldiers lose their location, even if they're stood on top of you. Why? But it does give you the edge you kind of need, especially at higher difficulties. With that all said, let's talk about the negatives. While the split mechanics are cool, they aren't really that flashed out and honestly are pretty superfluous, if not outright completely useless. I'm looking at you, dodge roll. The hand's traps are usable in only a couple of places throughout the campaign, mainly because it takes forever to plant them, and most of the time the enemy won't advance far enough to ever even trigger them. There's also the nectar grenades that trigger the psychotic episode in Mantle Soldiers, which is absurdly powerful right up until the final mission where it becomes completely useless because enemies are immune to it. And the fake death mechanic sadly boils down to a glorified full heal because the enemy AI is honestly too dumb to react to you getting back up. Speaking of, the AI is really dumb. Like, really dumb. Broken dumb. Allies will constantly walk into your line of fire. Enemies will sometimes not react to you being literally right next to them. Contrary to what I said earlier, some enemies will literally conga line into you, regardless of what kind of weapon they're using. They also like to repeat the same 5 voice lines on a loop every 15 seconds. The selection of weapons is abysmal. For the vast majority of the game, you'll probably be using one of 4 guns: the hand's rifle and shotgun, or Mantle's rifle and shotgun. The shotguns are nigh identical, and the only real difference between the rifles is fire rate. There are also power weapons, but outside of the sniper rifle, they generally aren't that much better than basic weapons. Some are even worse. Also, somewhat related, this is how aiming works while you're moving. It doesn't work like this. Nothing works like this. The vehicle sections are awful. If we were to think about this game as a Halo killer, it's not. The vehicle sections don't come anywhere close to how Halo plays. Halo has the right balance of speed and weight to it, and steering was very responsive. Vehicles in this are anywhere between trying to unstuck the evergreen or trying to stand up on a slip and slide. They also have this weird interaction with the concept of gravity, in the fact that the vehicles will always want to be flat, and hitting the ground from a jump somehow kills all momentum. And a quick mention to the turret sections that are so jittery that ADS is quite literally vomit-inducing. So, how bad is Haze? Treating it as a Halo killer, it's astronomically bad. But treating it as its own thing in the shooter space, it's not much better. I would hazard to put this game as one of the games I hate the most. Not in that it's irredeemable garbage, but I can see glimmers of a great game in here. It's just so marred with design issues, missed opportunities, and untapped potential that imagining what it could have been while seeing what it is makes me unnecessarily angry. But I can't really hold it against the devs though, from the sounds of development stories. Ubisoft really pissed in the well with this one. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments. I am the Resident Gremlin, and the ironic thing is, if they wanted a Halo killer, they could have just waited for 343 to do it for them.